Everybody to this month's Armchair History and from the Southport Historical Society, and I'm Liz Fuller from the Southport Historical Society. And as always, I want to thank the Friends of the Library and the Southport Library for helping us get the word out about these programs. So our topic this month is the Wilmington Massacre and Coup of 1898. So a few years ago, when I first started giving presentations on this topic, almost no one had heard of the Wilmington Massacre and Coup of 1898. Lately, due to some recent events, it's gotten more notice in the press and in the past few months. And also there was a new book that was published about it last year. But if you haven't heard about it, or you're not really sure what happened, don't feel bad, because most people still don't know the real story. And the main reason for that is that it was not taught in public schools, especially when we were all growing up. It used to be mentioned briefly in North Carolina textbooks in the early 1900s, but it was a different version of events than the one I'm going to tell you today. Because for over 100 years, the true story of what happened in Wilmington was buried and a lie was told in its place. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today will be disturbing, to say the least. But I agree with this statement from Colorado State Representative Leslie Herod. She said, if we're not honest about our history, if we don't face our past, then we'll never be able to move forward as a nation and a country. And I would say that's true not just for our country, but for our state, our county, our city, and our community. So programs like this presentation today are a way that we're working together to move forward as a community, and I commend all of you for choosing to learn more about topics in American history that are often overlooked. So the reason I first learned about the massacre was that I was doing some research on a journalist named Harry Hayden. Harry grew up in Wilmington around the turn of the century, but he had a fondness for Southport. He used to visit Southport a lot when he was growing up. He would visit with his mother. She had been a history teacher before she got married, and they would travel down the Cape Fear River on the riverboat, and she would tell Harry stories about the people who lived there, and she would lament the fact that so few people knew their own history. So as an adult, Harry married into the family that owned that steamship line. Their last name was Harper. And even though they were from Southport, they were a different family than the newspaper Harpers that you might be familiar with. Now, Captain Harper was very well known and well liked in both Wilmington and Southport. And the steamships were very important to both cities at that time, as there were no real roads across Brunswick County. All the travel came by steamship or other ships. Harry married Captain Harper's niece, Rebecca, and he became friends with two of his brothers-in-law, Captain Jesse Price of Southport and Mr. William French of Wilmington. So this is important because they were all a bit older than Harry. Hayden was still a little boy in 1898 when the events in Wilmington occurred, so he didn't have firsthand knowledge of it. But his brothers-in-law were already adults. They witnessed it, and they even played small parts in it. A few years after he married Rebecca, Hayden wrote a book about the events, and he got some of the information for his book from his wife's family. So this is Harry's book. He called it The Story of the Wilmington Rebellion, and he said that it was the first authentic account of the Wilmington Revolution of 1898, which resulted in the elimination of the Negro as a political factor in Wilmington and North Carolina, and which led to the disenfranchisement of the race throughout the South through the instrumentality of the Grandfather Clause. So like I said, when I stumbled across this book, I had never heard of the Wilmington Rebellion. So I read it, and then I read it again, and then I read it a third time. It's only about 40 pages. It's more of a pamphlet than a book. I was really confused because it seemed to me that what Hayden was describing was a political coup. And that's not a term I associate with the United States of America. So as I'm sure you all know, a coup d'etat is the violent overthrow of an existing government by a small group. It's not something that generally happens in the United States because we have a system of voting people in, and if they're corrupt, we can seek to impeach them, but we don't overthrow them with violence. And yet that's what Harry said happened. So in fact, Hayden described a 4-step plan that he said was carried out by the political leaders and other middle-class white men of Wilmington. The first step was to steal the election. The second step was to lead a riot. And the way they would do that would be to burn down the only Black newspaper office in Wilmington. Then they would stage the coup, and they would force out the mayor, the alderman, the police chief, and put their own people in power. And finally, they would force everyone that they thought would be against them to leave town and never come back. Now, remember I said that for over 100 years, there was another version of the events of what happened in 1898. And this version was perpetrated by Alfred Waddell. Now, he didn't call it a rebellion. He called it a race riot. Now, he didn't invent that term, but he popularized it. And unlike Hayden, he was there. He was actually there during the riots, and he was an active participant. In fact, he was one of the masterminds of the plan. And Waddell's version of the events was different. He said, first of all, they won the election. They didn't steal it. Secondly, they were forced to put down a riot. He said, yes, they had destroyed the Black newspaper, but they felt justified in doing this. And that, yes, a fire had broken out while they were there, but he didn't know how it started. And that they didn't start the violence. I'm sorry, I lost my thought. They didn't start the violence, they just responded to it. He said that afterwards, the leaders of Wilmington were so embarrassed that they had not been able to prevent the violence and that they had obviously lost the confidence of the community. So they offered up their resignations. And so he and the other town leaders were forced to quickly find replacements, which is how he became mayor. And then finally, he said that a lot of people, especially Black people, just left town because they didn't want to be there anymore. So why are there two different stories? Well, Waddell and Hayden had two very different agendas. Waddell was a politician. He was involved in the events, and he was concerned about the consequences of his actions. He and the men involved in the conspiracy didn't know whether the federal government would take action against them. This was only 22 years after the end of Reconstruction, and for all they knew, the President of the United States would send Union troops back in to occupy Wilmington. After all, McKinley was a Republican president that Blacks had helped vote into office and who had publicly condemned violence against Blacks. If he knew the true story, he might take action. Hayden, on the other hand, was writing his book nearly 40 years after it happened. He wasn't concerned about consequences. He interviewed a lot of the white participants in the riot and he wrote down their stories. Now, he didn't do this as some investigative journalist trying to expose the truth and get the people involved punished. No, he actually admired what they had done and he wanted to document their planning and their actions so that others could learn from it and maybe recreate it in their own cities. Because the one thing that Waddell and Hayden had in common was that they were unapologetic white supremacists. And whether the riots were spontaneous, as Waddell said, or planned, as Hayden said, they both agreed that the violence was necessary. So, what was going on in Wilmington that made them think that this was necessary? At the time, Wilmington was North Carolina's largest and most important city. There were about 20 to 25,000 people living there, and over half of them were African American. Wilmington was the state's biggest port, and they shipped tons of cotton around the world. It was a modern city. There were streetlights and electric trolleys and telephones and telegraphs. And 1 in 5 of all businesses were owned by Blacks. Blacks owned 10 out of 11 eating houses and 20 out of 22 barbershops. There were only 4 fish and oyster shippers in Wilmington, and 1 was owned by a partnership of 2 Black men. Black men were the most sought after craftsmen. They were the tailors, the blacksmiths, the shoemakers, the stonemasons, the plasterers, the plumbers, the wheelwrights, the brick masons, and the carpenters. When you go to Wilmington and you see Thalian Hall and Bellamy Mansion and all the other antebellum buildings, they were built by enslaved labor. And after emancipation, these craftsmen still had all of these skills. They used them to earn a living, and then they taught them to their children. In addition, a small but significant Black middle class was growing up in Wilmington. There were Black lawyers, architects, teachers, and principals. There were 6 school board members, 4 or 5 deputy sheriffs, 14 policemen, 2 fire departments, a legislator, a registrar of deeds, 4 health officers, coroners, postal workers, mail carriers, and 1/3 of the aldermen were African American. And the collector of customs for the port, which was a well-paying federal job, was African American, and that was in fact the top-paying government job in the state. There was a Black-owned building and loan that helped people build houses and commercial buildings. Over 1,000 Black Wilmingtonians owned some sort of property, including the Frederick Sajwar house that you see here that was built in the late 1800s and is still standing. And then there was the Daily Record. This is the newspaper that we keep talking about. It was the only daily Black newspaper in the United States. It had both Black and white readers and advertisers. And by the 1890s, the Black male literacy rate in Wilmington was as high as that of the whites. So now, to understand the story of what happened, you need to understand who all the players were. And this can be a little confusing because we still use some of the same words today, but they mean different things. So first we had the Democrats. Now, these are the Southern Democrats, and they stood for different things than the Democrats do today. This was the conservative party. They were mostly older white men, they were wealthy, they were business leaders, and many of them had fought in the Confederacy. They were resistant to change. They didn't like what was happening in the state, and they wanted things to go back to the way they were. So when you hear Democrats during this presentation, think conservative. Then we had the Republicans. Now they were the Progressive Party. This was a new party. It was the party of Abraham Lincoln. It was mostly composed of Unionists, freed slaves, and their descendants. And the African Americans were fiercely loyal to this party. Then you had a new party, the Populists. Now this was a progressive party. It was mostly made up of farmers and rural whites. So in the late 1800s in North Carolina, if you were Black or you were from the North, you voted Republican. If you were white and you had money, you voted Democrat. And if you were white and you didn't have much money, you probably voted Populist. And at first, that didn't matter to the Democrats because, as you can see, they outnumbered everybody else. But then somebody realized that the Republicans and the Populists had some things in common. They didn't agree on everything, but they both wanted more jobs and public schools and lower interest rates. And they realized that if they worked together, they might outnumber the Democrats. So they decided to cooperate with each other and fuse together. And so they formed sort of an uneasy alliance called the Fusionist Party because they fused together. And this is significant because it was the first time there was an interracial alliance for political ends. It was truly historic and it was powerful. So now that you know who the players are, let's real quickly review a timeline of what's going on in the 1800s. So we had the Civil War from 1861 to 1865. Then in 1865, right after the war, we had the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, and that outlawed slavery for everyone except convicts. Then in 1868, there was the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and that gave citizenship to everyone born in the United States. And then in 1870, there was the 15th Amendment, which gave the right to vote to all male citizens, regardless of color. So boom, boom, boom. All three of those amendments to the Constitution happened that quickly. And to get back in the Union, every Southern state had to accept those three amendments. So this period of time following the war was called Reconstruction. And for most of that time, Union troops occupied the South. And that lasted about 12 years when it ended very abruptly in 1877. Now, after that time, the Democrats, the conservative party, started taking back over control of North Carolina. But then in 1894, that was the first time the Fusionist Party ran a ticket. And lo and behold, they won. They won all the elections, including sending a populist to the Senate. And then 2 years later, there was an election for governor, and Daniel Russell, a white Republican, became governor. And the year after that, Wilmington had an election, and the mayor was a fusionist. The majority of the aldermen were Republican, and 3 out of the 10 aldermen were African American. So that was 3 elections in a row, a national election, a state election, and a city election in which the conservative Democrats lost. So as you can imagine, this upset a lot of people. Now, one other thing I should mention on this timeline before we move on is that in 1896, there was also an important Supreme Court ruling, which I'll talk about a little bit later. It's called Plessy versus Ferguson. And that's the case that said separate but equal didn't violate the Constitution. And that's going to become very significant to a lot of people in just a few years. So in 1898, Wilmington was the center of North Carolina African-American political and economic success. And it was considered a symbol of Black hope across the South and, of course, 26 miles down the river in Southport. So before we finish telling the story of what went on in Wilmington, let's see what was happening right here. So remember at that time, Southport was the only incorporated town in Brunswick County. There were, of course, people living in other parts of the county, but they weren't in incorporated towns. So the population at that time was about 1,200 people, and about a third of them were African Americans. So I'm going to mention a few names. Some of these might be familiar to you. There was Melissa Jackson, who owned over 900 acres of farmland. She was a midwife, a businesswoman, and a philanthropist. There was Frank Gordon, a well-known educator in Brunswick County who taught many, many people to read and write. There was Abram Galloway, who fought in the Union Army during the war, and in 1897, he was the chairman of the Southport Republican Party. There was Whitfield Griffin. He was a property owner who, along with his wife and a friend, owned the land that the John N. Smith Cemetery is on today. He sold that property to the Black churches for the cemetery. He was also a constable. And there was Wesley Lee, who, along with Whitfield Griffin, served on the Southport School Committee, not a separate African-American school committee, but the Southport Committee. There were James Griffin and Freeman Hankins, who built several houses on Rhett Street and some of the original 100 lots of Smithville. And there was Frank Davis, who was the first African-American postmaster of Southport, and Miss Sarah McKenzie, who was one of the first and possibly the first African-American in Southport to graduate from high school. And that wasn't as simple as it sounds, because there weren't any Black schools in all of Brunswick County that went over the 7th grade. So for her to do that, she had to travel 250 miles all the way to Elizabeth City and finish 4 years of school there. So just like in Wilmington, the majority of whites in Southport were conservative Democrats. But there was one election in May of 1887 when the African Americans figured out a way around that. They didn't have the majority, but the whites were running 2 separate tickets for the parties. And so they split their vote among the candidates. And all day, the African Americans kind of held back from voting. They had some men running as well. And so at the end of the day, they came forward and they cast their votes and tipped the hand, and they managed to elect 4 Black men for town commissioners. And the whole experience left the white voters feeling a bit hoodwinked. So back to the problems in the rest of the state. And that's what it was. It wasn't just Wilmington. There were concerns all over the state that things were changing and the Conservative Party was losing control. And of course, they were very concerned about what was happening. So the head of the North Carolina Democrat Party, Furnifold Simmons, said, "I know how to fix this. I have a plan." He said, "We're not going to win on issues, so put that aside." He said, "We need to draw those populists, those white people, back into the Democrat Party. And in order to do that, we're going to run a campaign based on white supremacy." He said, "We're going to remind them of the importance of race." And he said, "I can do this, but I need men who can speak, who can write, and who can ride." Second. Okay. So by men who could speak, he meant public speakers. So this was before the internet and television and radio. So people would actually go around and deliver speeches. And then oftentimes those speeches would get written up in newspapers. So Alfred Waddell was one of the speakers, and he would give very fiery speeches. And there was one speech he gave in October 1898 in Wilmington that has pretty much haunted Wilmington ever since. He said that he would end Negro domination if he needed to choke the current of the Cape Fear with carcasses. So very fiery rhetoric. And then he said he needed men who could write. So Josephus Daniels bought the News and Observer newspaper in Raleigh. He was a conservative. He worked with Furnifold Simmons. He said, "I'll make this newspaper the mouthpiece of the Conservative Party and of the white supremacy movement." So he set about to publish anti-Black propaganda in his newspaper, the News and Observer. And so did the Charlotte Observer to some extent, and other newspapers did as well. So there were a lot of newspapers that were talking very badly about African Americans, exaggerating stories, and even making them up. Daniels printed numerous articles that were intended to stoke fears of Black men as rapists of white women. So for example, a lone white woman who noticed a Black man in her vicinity, that would be written up in the paper as a narrowly avoided rape. Copies of his newspaper were sold at cost to the Democratic Party, which then distributed them free to white voters. So remember at that time that 25% of white voters were illiterate. So Jody Daniels also made very good use of political cartoons. He had a very good cartoonist named Norman Jennett who worked for him. And whether or not you could read, these images were very powerful and they stuck with you. So I'm going to give you a couple examples so you can see. This one was in the Raleigh paper in August of 1898, the year of the election. And you can see we have a white man being smashed under the boot of the Negro. And it says, "A serious question, how long will this last?" And then 2 weeks later, he printed this one. So we see this arm coming out labeled "Honest White Man." And it looks like he's holding a club, but it's actually a ballot. And he's bludgeoning this caricature of an African-American man. And the man's cap, the feather in his cap says "Negro rule." And the caption says, "A warning, get back. We will not stand it." And then 2 weeks before the election, we see this cartoon. This dapper Southern gentleman is getting ready to cast his vote, and right behind him is the devil. And the devil is labeled fusionist. And he's whispering in his ear, and he's reaching his arm around to nudge his ballot into the box. And his ballot says, "Negro rule." And the caption says, "Don't be tempted by the devil." So and then Furnifold Simmons said he needed men who can ride. And by that, he meant vigilantes. And so they formed a group called the Red Shirts, based on some groups that had already formed in South Carolina. And these men would ride around in broad daylight and with guns. They'd march around with guns and rifles. They would break up Republican political gatherings or Black people trying to vote or trying to register to vote. So anytime Black people or fusionists were trying to gather together, they would disrupt it. And then these are members of the Wilmington Light Infantry with a machine gun, and they would drive around the town and point the gun at Black churches and other meeting places to intimidate gatherings. There was a concern at the time that churches were being used as armories for guns, which didn't quite make sense because Blacks were not allowed to purchase guns, so it wasn't really clear where they would be getting them. No stockpiles were ever found. They also ordered a Gatling gun, which they used for a demonstration among Black leaders to further intimidate them. So we've talked a lot about this newspaper that was upsetting everybody. They wanted to trash this newspaper, and it was a big point with the campaign. So what was that about? So it started with a woman named Rebecca Felton, who was the wife of a senator in Georgia. Now, she's no relation to the Rebecca Felton who lives in Southport, if you know her. This was a different Rebecca Felton. This woman was a speaker, and she was asked to talk to the Farm Bureau. And she was asked what were some of the concerns of the farm wives in the South. And she said, well, after reading all of these articles in the newspaper about African Americans, that one of the big concerns of farm wives is being raped. And she said, if it needs lynching to protect women's dearest possession, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary. So she gave that speech in 1897, which was a year before the election. But a year later, it got picked up by the newspapers because the campaign was going on, because they thought it was good and it would help further their cause. So Alexander Manley was the editor of the Daily Record, the Black daily newspaper in Wilmington that we keep referencing. He was the grandson of a former North Carolina governor and his grandmother, who had been enslaved by the governor. And Manley started the newspaper, and he published an editorial in response to her speech. Felton's speech. He didn't write this particular article, but he published it. It was a very long editorial, so I pulled out parts of it. So first he talked about the anti-Black propaganda going on in the state. He said, the papers are filled often with reports of rapes of white women and the subsequent lynching of the alleged rapists. The editors pour forth volumes of aspersions against all Negroes because of the few who may be guilty. If the papers and speakers of the other race would condemn the commission of crime because it is crime and not try to make it appear that the Negroes were the only criminals, they would find their strongest allies in the intelligent Negroes themselves, and together the whites and blacks would root the evil out of both races. And then he went on, tell your men that it is no worse for a black man to be intimate with a white woman than for a white man to be intimate with a colored woman. You set yourselves down as a lot of carping hypocrites in that you cry aloud for the virtue of your women while you seek to destroy the morality of ours. Don't think that ever that your women will remain pure while you are debauching ours. And then he ended it with, you sow the seed, the harvest will come in due time. So that was quite upsetting to a lot of people. As Harry Hayden said, the white citizens of Wilmington and North Carolina became enraged over this unwarranted attack by the smart aleck Manley upon the virtue and character of Southern womanhood, which indeed was in flower in the entire Southland. And the response to this article in the white community was very strong, and there were many people who said they should lynch Manley for publishing it. But Furnifold Simmons, remember he was in charge of the white supremacy movement, he said, no, 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 this is gold. I couldn't have asked for anything better. He said, be sure you do not do anything to him until after the election. So almost every day the newspapers printed this horrible article that Manley had published, and they said, it's terrible, he should be killed, it was vile, it should never have been printed. And if you'd like to read it, we have it right here. But of course they didn't print all of what he said. They printed the parts that were most upsetting. So it just fell right into what they were planning, and it became a rallying point for the Conservative Party. And now, if any of the white men had any qualms about breaking the law to achieve their ends, they could kind of turn it around in their minds and think, well, the ends justify the means because I'm fighting for the protection of white womanhood, and then they could feel justified and virtuous about what they were doing. So the day before the election arrived, Alfred Waddell gave a speech at Thalian Hall, and he said, you are Anglo-Saxons, you are armed and prepared, and you will do your duty. Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find the Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls. And if he refuses, kill him, shoot him down in his tracks. We shall win tomorrow if we have to do it with guns. The morning of the election, there was an article in the front page of the paper. It said, what will you be? Today, white men of North Carolina must declare where they stand. It's a question of race, not politics. It's no longer a question of party, but of race. A fearful responsibility rests upon each voter, and the white men will mark and hold responsible each man who deserts his race. So this is an excerpt from an article, and the capitalization is the way it was printed in the newspaper. I didn't change that. So they were no longer just content with intimidating the African Americans from voting. They were also intimidating white men and saying, you better vote with your race because we are watching you and there will be repercussions. So who do you think won? This is the newspaper from after the election. White supremacy triumphs in the Old North State. That was a nickname for North Carolina. Fusionists utterly routed. Indications point to a Democratic landslide from the mountains to the seashore. Victory sure and complete. Russell, Butler, Holton, Thompson, Eyre and company repudiated yesterday by the decent white people of the state. Negro rule damned. Hayden said, of course, there were some irregularities in this statewide election in this city, meaning Wilmington, and elsewhere in the state. But the white citizens realized that victory had to be won by hook or by crook. Otherwise, they would have to continue to live under the intolerable conditions of the time. So here's some statistics from the Wilmington election. I'm just going to briefly point out. So in the 5th precinct of the 1st ward, there were 30 white registered voters, and 456 of them voted. In the 4th precinct, there were 337 Black voters, but only 94 voted. And in the second precinct, there were 154 voters and only 39 voted. So there's evidence of ballot stuffing and intimidation that they used both of those in order to steal the election. Now, in Southport, Harry Hayden said this. Obviously, he got this story from his brother-in-law, Jesse Price. And it said, populist ballots, which had been printed on yellow paper, were ordered thrown out by Captain Jesse Price and other election officials at Southport, as the law specifically required that the ballots should be printed on white paper. So I don't know if there was intimidation or ballot stuffing in Southport, but it seems like they didn't need to do that because they just made a plan to discard the ballots and not worry about it. So the election was over, and the African-American people of Wilmington breathed a sigh of relief. There had been a lot of tension building up to the election. There had been a lot of concern about safety, but now the election was over. The day had ended peacefully. They could think, well, we lost, but there'll be another election in a few years, and at least we're all safe. But the next morning, Hugh Mcrae, one of the conspirators known as the Secret Nine, had the Wilmington Morning Star call for a mass meeting. The paper published this announcement: attention white men. There will be a meeting of the white men of Wilmington this morning at 11 o'clock at the courthouse. A full attendance is desired, as business in the furtherance of white supremacy will be transacted. So remember, the election of 1898, it was a statewide election, but Wilmington was not part of it. Wilmington didn't have another election scheduled for another 4 months. So the Republicans and the Fusionists were still in charge of the city. So there was a group of people that felt they still had some business to do. They weren't done. They weren't satisfied with just the statewide election. So on the morning of November 9th, the courthouse was packed. There were 600 men of all professions and economic classes jammed in there. Hugh Mcrae sat in front with the former mayor and other prominent white conservatives. When Alfred Waddell arrived, Mcrae provided him with a copy of the White Declaration of the Independence, White Men's Declaration. And Waddell read it to the crowd. It said, among other things, it said, "We, the undersigned citizens of the city of Wilmington and the county of New Hanover, do hereby declare that we will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin." Now, William French, who was Hayden's brother-in-law, said that there were longer speeches by Waddell and Mcrae and other men there, but that there were also shorter speeches that were 10 or 15 minutes each, and he said he gave one of those. So I've been able to corroborate he was there. He did sign the Declaration of Independence, and he gave a toast thanking the newspapers for their coverage of what they were doing. So I don't know if that may be what he counted as his speech that he gave, or maybe that was part of a larger speech he gave. The next day, the Wilmington Morning Star printed the minutes of the meeting and the text of the declaration. And that included their intention to remove Alexander Manley from Wilmington and to destroy the printing press. They also mentioned they'd like to remove the mayor, the sheriff, and the alderman, but they had tabled that suggestion as possibly being too radical. Then they had called a meeting of prominent African Americans in Wilmington because they gathered them all together, they read them the declaration, and they said they were going to have them remove Manley and shut down his newspaper. And the men that they had gathered said they would see what they could do, and they would try to use their influence to do that. And so the men who had called them in said they wanted it in writing by 7 a.m. the next morning, and they wanted it delivered in person to Alfred Waddell. So the men went away and they wrote a letter. Now, there's some controversy about this letter, both how it was delivered and also the contents of the letter. The attorney who delivered the letter said that the letter that's come down in posterity is not the letter that the men had written. They wrote one, they say they wrote one that said, the paper's already been shut down for 2 weeks and Manley isn't in the city, so it's a moot point, move on. Probably not that forcefully. The letter that came down, I think it's a little bit suspect because it signed the Committee of Colored Citizens, which is what Waddell and the other men called these men, but they didn't designate themselves the Committee of Colored Citizens. They were just African-American businessmen that they had all called together. So We're not really sure. This is a letter that's come down in posterity, and it says, "We, the colored citizens to whom was referred the matter of expulsion from the community of the person and press of A.L. Manley, beg most respectfully to say that we are in no wise responsible for, nor in any way endorse the obnoxious article that called forth your actions. Neither are we authorized to ask for him in this matter, but in the interest of peace, we will most willingly use our influence to have your wishes carried out. Very respectfully, the Committee of Colored Citizens." But the problem with this letter, or any letter, is that it wasn't delivered by 7 a.m. directly to Waddell. They gave it to this attorney to deliver it, and they don't know why he didn't do that. They don't know if it's because he was, maybe he misunderstood the directions, or if he was intimidated by Waddell, or if he was worried that he was going to be captured when he delivered it. They're not really sure, but in any event, instead of delivering it to his personally, he put it in the mailbox. And so the next morning, no letter. So Waddell went over to the armory where men were gathered. They were waiting for the response. There were hundreds of men there already. So finally at 8:30, Waddell said, "Well, we haven't gotten a response. We're going to have to take matters into our own hands. So let's march over." So they started marching across town from the armory across Wilmington to Brooklyn, where the printing press was. And as they marched, more men joined and more men joined. And so there are estimates there were maybe 1,000 men altogether that had joined in. When they arrived, they discovered the building was empty. Manley had already fled the city in fear of his life, and that's him circled on in that picture. So there was no activity going on. So the men went ahead, they destroyed the printing press. In the process, fire broke out and the building burned. Waddell later said, "I believe that the fire which occurred was purely accidental. It certainly was unintentional on our part. I saw smoke issuing from the top story. Someone said the house was afire. I could not believe it. There were a number of kerosene oil lamps hanging round. They were thrown down and smashed, and the kerosene ran over the floor. So it's possible that some fellow set it afire with a match." This is a picture of the men that they took afterward to show that they had been there. The newspaper office was actually up on the second floor where it's all burned. And it's hard to see. The people that are up on the top, those are African Americans. They're actually wearing helmets, and those are firemen. After the fire had burned for a while, it started to threaten other buildings. So they did call the fire department and ask them to put it out. And Waddell was very complimentary about their work. He said that they did a great job. When they were done burning it down and getting their photos taken for posterity, Waddell said, "All right, men, we are done here. We've done what we've come to do. Now disperse, go home." And he said, "Don't cause any more trouble unless trouble finds you." And then he left and went to City Hall, and the men started to disperse. So at the same time, there were a lot of Black men at work across town, and they began to hear rumors that there were fires in their neighborhood and that there were men marching with guns, and they were worried about their wives and their children. So they started heading home. And at the same time, the white men who destroyed the printing press were marching toward them. And so eventually they ran into one another. And as Hayden said, all hell broke loose. So the red mark in the upper right corner of this map is the office of the Daily Record where they set the fire. And then that pale red line that you see is where the men marched on their way back to town. And then in the center here, that's where Thalian Hall is. And then this light blue mark over here, that's where that cotton plant was that the men were working. Now, the blue roads that you see, that is the Black part of town where the fighting took place. And the red marks you see are known deaths of Black men. The yellow marks are the 3 injuries to white men. And the green mark is an injured Black man. So that's all happening over there. It's a little suspicious to me because obviously the men who were working would have gone to their homes, and the paper where they burned it down was was in the opposite direction. And so even if the men came back, it looks like they would have had to march into the Black section of town in order for altercations to occur. This is a picture of 4th and Harnett Streets in Wilmington where the first Black men fell. And you can see 2 X's on there where someone has drawn where the bodies were. They marked their own picture. This is a photo that was taken on 5th Street where additional killings took place. And so you can see at the bottom it says 5th Street crossmark where 2 Negroes were killed. And you can just barely see the pencil marks, so I did go over them with red, but those were where they are. It's impossible to know how many people were killed that day. We do know that 3 white men were injured. And at the time, Waddell said 10 or 11 Black men were killed. In his memoir, he later said 20. Hayden documented 25. Researcher Lorraine Umfleet says she can document 60 Black men killed. And the oral tradition among Black Wilmingtonians is as many as 100. There are several reasons that we can't find out. One reason is that the next day, when they were permitted to go and retrieve the bodies, some people just took them and buried them in their backyard. They didn't want any more trouble, and the person that had been killed may have been the person that they relied on to protect them. It might have been their husband, their father, their brother, and now he was gone and they had no one to protect them. So they just buried them quietly. There may have also been bodies thrown in the river by the rioters as Waddell had threatened. In addition, as the violence was taking place, many people ran away. They ran into the cemetery, they ran into the swamps. It was November, it was cold, they had no shelter, they had no food. It was mostly women and children, and they were terrified. Some of them never returned. They found their way to other parts of North Carolina and Virginia and Brunswick County. Over the next couple of weeks and months, over 2,000 people left Wilmington because they no longer felt safe there. So there's no way now to research who's missing and determine who was killed because people were missing for various reasons. Meanwhile, while all this violence was taking place, Waddell had left the men and gone back to Thalian Hall. City Hall was on the 2nd floor. And he and his colleagues met with the mayor and aldermen and sheriff. And one by one, they forced them at gunpoint to resign. And then they put new men in their place. And that's when Waddell became mayor. Then they marched them down to the train station. They put them on a train and they said, don't ever come back to Wilmington. The conspirators had created a list ahead of time of between 20 and 25 people that they wanted out of the city who they thought would be a threat. Most were African American, but there were also some white men who they thought would be resistant to the change. So they rounded them up, they put them in jail overnight for safekeeping, and the next day they marched them to the railroad and they put them on a train and they said, don't ever come back. Harry Hayden said, the men who took down their shotguns and cleared the Negroes out of office yesterday were not a mob of plug uglies. They were men of property, intelligence, culture. Clergymen, lawyers, bankers, merchants. They're not a mob. They are revolutionists asserting a sacred privilege and a right. This is the Wilmington Morning Star from that same morning. Bloody conflict with Negroes. White men forced to take up arms for the preservation of law and order. Blacks provoke trouble. Negro newspaper plant destroyed. The whites fired upon by Negroes. The firing returned. The killed and wounded, state guard out, many exciting incidents. And in the Raleigh News and Observer, a day of blood at Wilmington. Negroes precipitate conflict by firing on the whites. Manley, the defamer of white womanhood, escapes. Building of his slanderous paper gutted and burned. 11 Negroes were killed. 3 whites wounded. Board of Aldermen changed illegally. Mayor and chief of police resign. City under control of new and conservative Democratic government. Mayor Waddell puts guards around jail to protect Negro prisoners. There was some effort to tell the other side of the story in the conflict. This is from the Richmond Planet, which was a weekly Black newspaper out of Virginia and had a readership of about 4,200. Horrible butcheries at Wilmington. The Turks outdone. Innocent and unarmed colored men shot down. Hundreds run to the woods. The mob captures the town. White ministers, aiders and abettors of murder. The governor powerless and the president of the United States silent. God's aid implored, the cries of defenseless, anarchy rules. About 2 weeks later, Waddell published an article about the events in Collier's Weekly, which was a national magazine. This is an illustration that accompanied his article, so you can get a feel about the tone of what that story was about. And Waddell's story became the official version of the events for about 100 years, despite some efforts by Black authors and by historians to publicize alternate views. The coup and the massacre had long-term consequences to Wilmington. You can see that before this event, the Black population of Wilmington outnumbered the white population and was growing steadily. After this event, the population dropped considerably. It continued to grow over time, but at a much slower pace, and it never achieved a majority again. In North Carolina, during the elections of 1896 for governor and for president, which was the last elections that happened before this election, you can see that about 60% of the votes were Republican. 4 years later, you can see the voting was nearly 100% Democrat. So North Carolina, in effect, became a one-party state, and it stayed that way for decades. So Harry Hayden mentioned that not only was this a story of the Revolution of 1898, but also the elimination of the Negro as a political factor in Wilmington and North Carolina. And the way that that happened is that once the Conservative Party was in power in North Carolina, they went about changing voting laws, including what became known as the Grandfather Clause. So North Carolina was not the first state to change their voting laws to exclude Black voters. Other states had tried it, but some of their laws were declared unconstitutional. So North Carolina looked at what had already been done to determine how they could do it better. They came up with a plan that appeared racially neutral on the surface. First, they required a literacy test before registering to vote. So this may sound fair, but it was targeted. Illiteracy was still at about 30% in voting age Black males across North Carolina. In addition, the test was subjective, and the registrars defined what literacy meant. So in Brunswick County, even as late as the 1950s, the head of the Cedar Grove NAACP was denied the ability to register because he couldn't pass the literacy test. So he recounted that the registrar in Southport first asked him, "How many bricks are in the courthouse?" He responded, "Well, tell me the dimensions of the building and I'll calculate it." So then he was asked, "How many bubbles are in a bar of soap?" The literacy test came with a caveat. If the voter or a lineal ancestor had voted before 1867, then he didn't have to take the literacy test. Since even free Black men were not allowed to vote before 1867, this was basically designed to allow illiterate white men to avoid the literacy test and continue voting. So on this form here, you can see this man is illiterate. There's his mark. He gave an X. It says his, and someone has written his mark around it and then written his name for him. But he's signing up, registering to vote. And then even if a person had passed the test and gotten registered, they had to pay a poll tax each year before they could vote. So that disproportionately impacted those with very little money. So even if you were registered to vote, you had to come up with the money for the tax in order to actually do it. The effect was that after 1900, Black men lost their right to vote in North Carolina, and this was deliberate. So remember I said that Plessy versus Ferguson had been passed in 1896, 2 years before the massacre. That was the ruling that separate but equal facilities that were based on race were constitutional. So instead of reading the ruling as is usually done, I thought it'd be interesting to quote from the dissent written by Justice J. Harlan. He was the only dissenter on the Supreme Court to the ruling, and he said, "In view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior, dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. The law regards man as man and takes no account of his surroundings or of his color when his civil rights, as guaranteed by the supreme law of the land, are involved. In my opinion, the judgment this day rendered will in time prove to be quite as pernicious as the decision made by this tribunal in the Dred Scott case, which was the fugitive slave law. Justice Harlan's prediction was prophetic, and this ruling, the Plessy versus Ferguson, is often listed among the worst decisions in the Supreme Court's history. So I just want to point out who these men are that I put on this chart. This is Homer Plessy. He was the man who was barred from sitting in the white section of the train. This is Judge Ferguson, who made the original decision that he appealed. And these two men here are Samuel Phillips and Albion Torgey, and they both appeared before the Supreme Court to argue for Plessy. And I mention them in particular because they were from North Carolina. So the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling led the government in North Carolina and other southern states to start passing laws for segregation. You may have heard them called Jim Crow laws. They were actually a combination of laws, codes, and customs. And one of the main reasons for passing them was power. The Conservative Party had seized power in North Carolina and they never wanted to lose it again. You remember when we talked about the Fusionist Party and how it was the first interracial political party in North Carolina, and it outnumbered the Conservative Party. They reasoned that one way to prevent that from happening again was to ensure that people did not interact with one another. So they made it so blacks and whites couldn't work together, live together, learn together, socialize together, worship together, or shop together. During the Jim Crow era, blacks and whites pretty much existed in separate spheres. So in Southport, what that meant was that all voting became Democrat, just like in the rest of the state. Only whites were in position of authority, like mayor, alderman, police chief, etc. Services like churches, cemeteries, schools, healthcare, and mortuaries were segregated. Restaurants and businesses were segregated. The Amusement Theater, blacks were allowed to go, but they had to sit up on the balcony. They couldn't sit down in the seats with the whites. There were separate entrances for blacks and whites at courthouse. There were even separate Bibles for people to be sworn in on. There were professions that were not open to blacks. For example, it was fine if black men wanted to work on the Menhaden fishing boats, but they couldn't be captain. So opportunities were much more limited. And they were also segregated in where they lived. Black communities were outside of town along Jabbertown Road and on the outskirts of Southport above Brown Street, which was outside the original 100 lots and only on the west side. So when you think about how small Southport is, but it was even smaller because the whites stayed on one side of town and the blacks stayed on the other. And they seldom overlapped. So I said that Waddell's version was the official version for about 100 years. Then in the year 2000, the state of North Carolina said, you know, we need to investigate what happened in Wilmington in 1898. So they put together a commission and they worked for that commission worked for about 6 years investigating it, and they produced a report. And in part, the report said, Wilmington's 1898 racial violence was not accidental. It began a successful statewide Democratic campaign to regain control of state government, disenfranchise African Americans, and create a system of legal segregation, which persisted into the second half of the 20th century. And that's really important because if you could look at this and say, well, it's 1898, it was so long ago, why do we care? But the ramifications continued on well into our lifetimes. It wasn't until the 1960s that the civil rights movement started, and then it was years before the overt discrimination and segregation lessened. And of course, it wasn't a magic wand. Many of the systems that were put in place persisted, and there were many open wounds. So this event that happened a long time ago has had a long-term effect today that we're still grappling with. And I want to be sure I don't give you the impression that what happened in Wilmington was an isolated event and that somehow the people of Wilmington or North Carolina are worse than other places. There have been riots in this country with white people attacking black people when they became too prosperous or powerful, or when and it was perceived that they were a threat since the 1830s. So this is a map of the larger massacres. They're generally referred to as riots. And just like in North Carolina, most of these are largely not talked about in schools. There was one difference with the Wilmington Massacre, and that is that it wasn't spontaneous. It was definitely planned, and it was planned by the leaders of the city. It was planned by the people who had money and power, and they very much manipulated the people who carried out the riot. And we know this because when enough time had passed, many of the people who were involved admitted it. And because they were able to do it, because they were able to kill innocent Black men on the street without any repercussion, they were emboldened to do more. I mean, in the beginning, they were worried. They thought the federal government might get involved. They thought troops might be sent down, but nothing happened. The Republican governor of North Carolina and the Republican president all looked the other way. And it wasn't like they weren't asked for help. McKinley, who had been put in office in part by the votes of Black Americans, received many letters and telegrams from men and women in Wilmington asking him to intervene. And McKinley had even indicated that he would not tolerate this kind of violence. And in his inaugural address, he said, lynchings must not be tolerated in a great and civilized country like the United States. Courts, not mobs, must execute the penalties of the law. But because he was not directly asked for help by the governor, he did not send aid. His cabinet and he decided that they did not have a constitutional right to intervene. Plus, all of the official information that they were getting out of Wilmington was that the crisis was over, there was nothing that needed to be done, nothing to see here. Now, at that time, North Carolina had one Black congressman. His name was George Henry White. He was from the 2nd District, which is often referred to as the Black Second. It was in the northeast part of North Carolina, where there was a large Black population due to the extensive slavery that had existed before the war. So following the war, state representatives had carved up new districts, and they created this very oddly shaped district to hold most of the counties that were predominantly Black. They reasoned it was better to have them most together and just give up one representative to Congress rather than having Black people scattered into different districts that might influence the outcomes of other races, political races. And possibly causing multiple congressional representatives. So there were other counties that had a high Black population, but they were able to couple them with other counties with largely white populations so that the whites could remain in the majority and retain those seats. So when you read nowadays about North Carolina's districts having been challenged in the Supreme Court because they're carved up in funny ways with gerrymandering, you can know that this is something North Carolina has been practicing since the Civil War. So in 1898, U.S. Congressman George White was in office representing the 2nd District of North Carolina. The following year, in 1899, Congressman White introduced the first anti-lynching bill into Congress to try and make the type of violence that had occurred in Wilmington and other places a federal crime. The bill died in committee. And from then until now, over 200 anti-lynching bills have been introduced and none have passed, even as recently as last year. Lynching is still not a federal crime. It's a state crime that's tried by the states where the incidents occur. So at the end of the day, nobody did anything. The governor, the president, the Senate, the Congress, the general population of the country, no one did anything. Everyone was complicit in this. Everyone let them down. We can't just say it was Wilmington, it was everyone. So now, you may be wondering, well, what happened to the people who orchestrated all of this? What were their consequences? Well, there were actually only positive consequences for them. Furnifold Simmons, who orchestrated the whole thing, ended up running for Senate in North Carolina. He ran as the chieftain of white supremacy because he was proud of what he had done. He was elected. He continued to serve for 30 years. He was the longest serving senator in North Carolina, and he continued to run on a platform of white supremacy. Alfred Waddell, the public speaker who fired up the mob, was known to visit Southport periodically. He was friends with Dr. Curtis, our quarantine physician and former mayor. Waddell became mayor of Wilmington during the coup when he held a gun to the head of then Mayor Silas Wright. He retained that role for 8 years, and then he passed away a few years later in 1912 at the age of 77. Josephus Daniels, who was the owner of the Raleigh newspaper, became the Secretary of Navy under President Woodrow Wilson and ambassador to Mexico under FDR. In his memoir, he admitted that during the election of 1898, the paper was occasionally excessive in its bias towards the Conservative Party, and that stories were not fully researched before publication and probably could not be sustained in a court of justice. However, he never apologized for using the newspaper to encourage white supremacist violence in 1898. In his memoir, he spoke positively about the actions of red shirts and how his white supremacy campaign had crushed Negro domination. The Daniels family owned and operated the News and Observer for 101 years before selling it in 1995. When the Wilmington Race Riot Report came out in 2006, the newspaper published an editorial apologizing for its role in the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. Hugh Mcrae, one of the leaders of the coup and one of the main authors of the White Man's Declaration of Independence, also never apologized for his role. He continued to be a white supremacist throughout his life. When he died, he donated land for a park to the city of Wilmington, stipulating that it only be used by white people. There was one man from North Carolina who experienced adverse consequences, Congressman George Henry White. After voting rights were taken away from African American men in 1900, he did not run for re-election. In January 1901, he was the last Black representative remaining in Congress at that time. Realizing that he was bringing to a close a 32-year period when nearly 40 Southern African Americans had sat in Congress, White used the occasion of his farewell address to remind that body and the nation of the reason for his defeat and the elimination of Black representation in the nation's capital. He also predicted that African Americans would return to Congress. His prediction became a reality 28 years later when Oscar DePriest was elected to represent a Chicago congressional district. But it would be 90 years before there was another Black representative from the state of North Carolina. Here's part of his farewell speech. He says, "It would be unfair, however, for me to leave the inference upon the minds of those who hear me that all of the white people of the state of North Carolina hold white supremacist views. Thank God there are many noble exceptions to the example. There never has been nor ever will be any Negro domination in that state. It is a convenient howl, however, often resorted to in order to consummate a diabolical purpose by scaring the weak and gullible whites into support of measure and men suitable to the demagogue." And then he ended with a plea to his fellow congressmen for their help to obliterate race hatred, party prejudice, and help us to achieve nobler ends, greater results, and become satisfactory citizens to our brethren white. This, Mr. Chairman, is perhaps the Negro's temporary farewell to the American Congress, but Phoenix-like, he will rise up someday and come again. So in the last year or so, more awareness has been raised of the events in Wilmington in 1898 and the part that individuals and organizations played in the massacre and coup. Last year, the Josephus Daniels great-grandchildren removed the statue of him that stood in Raleigh. They did it before it could be forcefully removed by the city or targeted by protesters. An elementary school named after Daniels was also renamed that year. Last year, the city of Wilmington decided to rename Hugh Mcrae Park. The Mcrae grandchildren supported the change of name, but the renaming of the park, like the removal of statues, was and is controversial. Some people think it is improper and covering up history, while others think the statues and naming of public squares was the actual covering up and rewriting of history in the first place. Others think that all these discussions about names and statues are a distraction and mere window dressing that do nothing to address the real problems of racism that still exist. 8 months after the official North Carolina report came out, the executive committee of the North Carolina Democratic Party voted unanimously to issue an apology for their party's involvement in the massacre. The same year, the North Carolina legislature had voted to apologize for the government's role in the 1898 election and the Wilmington Massacre, with only one Republican senator voting against the resolution. There are some historical markers in Wilmington commemorating the events of 1898. This one was put up in 2007, the year after the Wilmington Race Riot report was published. It says, Alex Manley edited Black-owned Daily Record 4 blocks east. Mob burned his office, November 10th, 1898, leading to race riot and restrictions on Black voting in North Carolina. To me, this seems to align more with Waddell's version of the events than on the revised version from the report. And on the website that leads you to this sign says Alex Manley is best known as the editor of the Daily Record, which was a newspaper that expressed the interests of Blacks in local and national communities. An opinionated publication in 1898 caused racial tension, which led to a race riot in Wilmington, North Carolina. So I can understand that maybe they got the sign a little wrong and that's hard to change, but it would seem like the website would be easier to revise if somebody wanted to do it. 2 years ago, they put up a sign to mark the event of the coup. It comes a little closer to the revised version, but it still leaves it ambiguous about how the African Americans died. It says, the Wilmington coup, armed white mob met at Armory here, November 10th, 1898, marched 6 blocks and burned offices of Daily Record, Black-owned newspaper. Violence left untold numbers of African Americans dead, led to overthrow of city government and installation of coup leader as mayor. Was part of a statewide political campaign based on calls for white supremacy and the exploitation of racial prejudice. So that one gets a little closer to what was in the report, but when you go to the website that's associated with it and it links it, you once again get verbiage that implies the violence was spontaneous and justified and puts the responsibility back on the newspaper article. And there's no explanation of the coup or the killings. It just says Wilmington coup, also known as Wilmington's race riot, on November 10th, 1898, after the publication of the Daily Record, an armed white mob met and marched the streets of downtown Wilmington. The mob burned the office of Alex Manley, the author of the Daily Record, due to what was said about white men. So again, seems like an easy fix since it's a website. But in recent years, North Carolina has begun teaching about 1898 in public schools and in 8th grade. So just looking at how challenging it is to create historical markers on websites that talk about it and get a consensus on what happened, you can imagine how difficult it is to teach the topic satisfactorily in schools. In addition, there's been increased pressure because 8th grade American history has been reduced to 1 semester, and this is local history, so it's not on any kind of national standardized test, so it's at risk of getting squeezed out. And in addition, right now, there's been a governmental debate lately about teaching topics like this, claiming that teaching these topics is anti-American, and it will teach North Carolina public school students that the nation is oppressive and racist. This is the 1898 memorial in Wilmington commemorating the event. There are several plaques at the memorial, and the wording is drawn from the North Carolina Commission's official report. The plaques are surrounded by 6 16-foot high paddles. These paddles commemorate those who lost their lives in the massacre. They represent the traditional religious belief among African cultures that those who pass from the world of the living to the world of the dead do so via water. And one of the plaques says, Wilmington's African-American majority included members of a growing middle class who served in the municipal government, the city's civil service, and in state and federal governmental positions. On November 10, 1898, an armed mob of whites led by some of Wilmington's most prominent citizens removed from office the city's duly elected biracial government in what historians consider the only successful coup d'etat in the history of the United States. So as you can imagine, there's even more to the story if you want to go deeper. I've really tried to touch on all the salient points, but these are some sources of information if you want. Wilmington's Lie was published last year. It's well done. The Marrow of Tradition was written by one of the first African-American novelists. He was from North Carolina, and he wrote a novelized version of it. So it's interesting to get a feel for what was thought of it at that time. And the 1898 Wilmington Race Riot report that I've highlighted there is available online. It's well written and it's free, and it's well researched and well done. So I am going to turn the screen back around and see if anybody has any comments or questions. All right.
Liz, that was an outstanding presentation, and I can't thank you enough for all the work that you put into this. I just finished Wilmington's Lie. I highly recommend it. Yep. This was not something I was taught in school, and it is appalling. So thank you for this.
Well, thank you, Diana. So, Lo, you've got the book too, I saw.
Oh, yes, I do. And I know David, and I respect his journalism. And I mean, he is a brilliant writer. But this book, you can't put it down. He writes it really almost like a galloping fiction, and you know every page you're dreading what's going to happen next. I'd also, Liz, this was just brilliant. Thank you. Amazingly well done. Just so impressive. As an Episcopal priest, now allegedly retired, I substitute at St. Mark's Episcopal Church up in Wilmington, which is at the corner of Grace and 6th Street. And the congregation is almost entirely African American. And they are actually, many of them are older than I am, which is saying something. And I hear from them a perspective on the massacre, and they always refer to it as the massacre, that we don't always hear. I mean, their grandparents and great-grandparents lived this, and it is as raw and hurtful to them today as it was in 1898 for their ancestors.
And I think that that's a major source of misunderstanding, because it is, like you said, it's passed down in oral tradition and they know about the story. A lot of white people don't know about the story, even if they're from Wilmington. It's not passed down, it was buried. And there's an assumption on the African-American side that people know, and they're just not talking about it. They're just not addressing it. They're just ignoring it. When in fact, a lot of them don't even know. So then there's all this unintentional hurt that happens because they're not acknowledging their own. So they both have two sets of reality. And so how do you connect if you don't even have the same set, the same set of reality? So I'm glad that there's more awareness of it now. And I think Wilmington's Lie has really helped to raise the awareness.
I was horrified by what you said about the North Carolina history, one semester, and may not even be enduring after into the future. Well, and I mean, so there's what is the chance of disseminating this to new generations?
I think they do something at the 3rd grade. They do like a field trip to like in Wilmington, they do something in the 3rd grade. They do a field trip to the monument. And then there's something with 8th grade. But when things get squeezed, it's the stuff that's not on the test that gets squeezed out. I'm not saying it's definitely getting squeezed out, but it's just at risk.
It's probably got a bullseye on it.
Liz, yes, of course, you did another wonderful job, and I'm very impressed with your graphics and the photographs and all. Your resources are amazing, so thank you very much for that. I thought about when we saw and you referred to the family, the Daniels family, is taking down that statue. I think one of our 2 ferries that goes back and forth to Fort Fisher is named the Governor Daniels.
Really?
And I wondered when that came up in your presentation, if there's been any talk of changing that name of that ferry because of his participation or whatever. But we never know what's going to be changed or tumbled down next. But thank you again. Thanks again for excellent program. Appreciate you a lot.
Thanks, Pat.
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions or comments? I'm just going to flip over real quick to Facebook and make sure. Well, no, I'm not. I don't have Facebook up. Never mind. Apparently, I'm not going to flip over to Facebook. So if they have questions, I'll answer them later in writing. Hey, Carolee, what's?
Hi, Liz. I too want to thank you so much. I gained insights that I hadn't had before, and I've read about this, but I'm also so sad in realizing how easy it is for people to twist a story and change the facts, and that is nothing new.
Mhm.
I also wondered if you have any idea what happened to Manley, the editor. Did you run across anything about that?
Yeah, he escaped and got out of North Carolina. He went to DC. I believe initially he stayed with that George Henry White in DC. I think he put him up. And then eventually he worked for some organizations to help. He never ran a newspaper again. He worked with organizations to help with job promotion for African Americans. And that house that I showed, I couldn't figure out how to work it in. I just put it there, that Sajwar house that I showed that was actually his father-in-law's house. So I just thought that was interesting that his wife was the daughter of that man. But yeah, he never had another newspaper, but he continued to work for, for job creation and things like that.
Thank you so much for all of it.
Yes, I want to echo that. It was a wonderful presentation. Wonderful.
Thanks, Kurt.
Yeah, I think we all know now that if we see Liz Fuller's name attached to any program coming up, we don't want to miss it.
Absolutely.
Well, there's a good lead in because next month I'm working on a new presentation called
Segue.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. Called Southport in Love and War. And so I'm looking at World War II and trying to find some of the little, the little love stories that happened between people in Southport and people in the military. And I thought, I always go so dark. I thought I'd try to go a little bit, although only I would think going to war is not going dark. But anyway, it should be good. I'll have it together by next month.
Sounds intriguing.
Anybody else? Any questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate you hanging in there. It's a tough topic, but it's so important, and it just seems even more important these days. You can just.
You may have to go on the show on the road all over North Carolina with your knowledge of this particular subject, because your original program that you did was so good, and this one is too. We can get you some gigs.
Do.
You work on that. So, all right. Well, good luck this afternoon in the cemetery, and I will see you guys next month, hopefully. Southport in Love and War. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Okay. Let's see. Stop recording.